Hartamu tertinggal di rumah. Stephen Ray berasal dari Gereja Baptis yang sangat anti dan meremehkan Gereja Katolik. Namun, tanpa bujukan siapapun, dia kembali ke rumahnya Gereja Katolik karena merasa unsur-unsur penting Gereja Para Rasul telah hilang dalam Gereja Baptis dan gereja-gereja Protestan.
So after we got married and had kids, I had a business and I was an evangelist. I was a Bible teacher. I taught the Bible in these born-again churches and in Baptist churches and Assembly of God kind of churches. I used to teach classes to Protestants on how to convert Catholics. But guess what? I was wrong. I was lying to people, but I didn't know I was lying to people. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I had the truth. But after all of these years of being an evangelist and a Bible teacher, in 1994, I became a Catholic with my whole family, my wife and 4 kids. And you may say, wow, what happened? If you're out there trying to convince Catholics to leave the Catholic Church, then what in the world happened to you? It's a good question. There was nobody that came and talked to me about the Catholic Church that changed my mind. I had never, at this point, neither my wife Janet nor I had ever once set foot in a Catholic church out of principle. Never had been in a Catholic church. Never once had I met a Catholic priest in person. I didn't want to meet one. And never once had my wife and I met a Catholic who could explain and defend their faith. I could talk to a Catholic and pick them off the tree like a ripe banana. Because Catholics that I knew had no idea what they believed, how to explain it or defend it. And why did I become a Catholic then? My journey to the Catholic Church began when I started to see the problems with Protestantism. And when I say Protestantism, I want you to know that I'm referring to all of those little groups that line the street. All the little assemblies of God, even the big assemblies of God, where you walk in the door and they're growing. Why? Because they love, love, love you. Come on in, we love, love, love you, and we also love your money. Don't ever think that those churches, it's all about loving you in the gospel. I know too many of these pastors in the United States, and I know that a lot of it is about money, and they preach a good message, but unfortunately many naive Christians fall for that stuff. You don't find the Archbishop here picking your pocket all the time every time you walk in. I have been amazed because I always heard about how the Catholic Church is always... They never have asked me for money, hardly ever. Not like those kind of churches. So, I began to see the problems with Protestantism, and I use the word Protestant to refer to all of those other groups outside of the Catholic Church. Those that broke away with Martin Luther and the Reformers in the 16th century. And where do you think the word Protestant comes from? Protest. We really should pronounce it protestism, because that's what it is. It's protest against... What are they protesting against? The Catholic Church. So I began to see the problems in my own tradition when I was there. Janet and I, between the two of us, we were members of Presbyterian churches, Baptist churches, Bible churches, Charismatic Pentecostal churches, Reformed churches, Bible alone, non-denominational churches. So don't tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. We went the whole circle of the desert before we finally found the oasis. And I began to see the problems in all of those churches. And I want to just touch on 3 of them for you tonight. Just 3. The number 1 is what is worship. Number 2 is what authority. And number 3, how many churches should there be? Number 1 started with Janet. We came home from the Baptist church one Sunday after hearing preaching for an hour. They sang a good song, they prayed, then they preached, then they collect money. And you know, there are some churches in the United States now, because they want your money so bad, they send a credit card machine up and down the aisles to get your credit card. So you just, they want to make sure. It's easier to use a credit card than to hand them $20. You know that. So we began to see the problems in all of these places. And the one that we saw first was worship, because Janet said on the way home from church one Sunday, I can't go listen to that man preach anymore and call it worship. Something's missing, but I don't know what it is. You all know what it was. What was missing? Sacrifice. The holy sacrifice of the Mass. The Eucharist at the hands of the priest. Every human being that has had a religion in all of time, all people, when they came to the God or the gods or whatever they perceived the deity to be, they never came empty-handed. They always came with an offering or a sacrifice. Even the Jews had sacrifices. All the religions have sacrifices. You know about that here in India. And our church did not have a sacrifice. We just had preaching. So when I began to think about it, and by the way, that Janet started our whole journey into the Catholic Church. It wasn't me. Janet started it. And when her father got angry at me and he said, "You took my daughter out of the Presbyterian church into that cult," I said, "I didn't start it. It was the woman you gave me." So we started thinking about what worship was. And I realized that about worship, there has to be an offering or a sacrifice. It doesn't just mean adding 5 new guitars. These churches out there do not have the sacrifice. They do not have the blessed sacrifice of the Mass. The earliest Christians from the 1st century had an altar. They had the Mass. And I have now, since becoming a Catholic, my wife and I have been to every single one of the oldest churches in the world. You couldn't build churches before 300 AD because it was illegal. But once Emperor Constantine legalized it in 313, people started building churches. And I have been to every single one of the first churches, whether it's in Israel or Egypt or Italy or Syria, anyone. I've been to all of them. And I can tell you for a fact that every single one of them had one thing in common. Some were circular churches, some were square, made of stone, made of brick, made of wood. But every church had one thing in common, and that is in the front, in the center, they had an altar. And in front of the altar was a priest. Right from the 1st century. You go back and read the first writings of Christianity, there was always an altar. And what is an altar? The technical definition of the word altar is a place of sacrifice. In the Old Testament, an altar is where you killed an animal and blood came off the altar. An altar is a place of sacrifice, and every single church in the first 1,500 years had an altar, and in front of the altar was a priest. And then a guy named Martin Luther came along, and his buddies Zwingli and Bucer and Melanchthon and a bunch of others, and they said, "We don't need the Pope," and they threw the Pope away, and "We don't need the tradition," and they threw the tradition away. And the next thing most of them went after was the altars, and they removed the altars from the front of the church. And what did they put in their place? In their place they put a podium, a lectern, and it was now a different religion. Real Christianity from the beginning had an altar with a priest. My church only had a podium with a preacher, and it was a different religion. And eventually Janet and I said, why is our church today different than all the churches was all the way back to the apostles? Number one reason that opened our eyes to the Catholic Church.